sideways for a second to also say to you that I don't have time to give you all our methodology here, but yeah, we are studying southeast Queensland, but in reality, we're studying the region of Lilliput. Now, why Lilliput? Well, it's because when we started this process, local governments, both elected members and officers, and state government, politicians and officers, were very nervous about us doing this research, talking about something that might happen 20 to 50 years in the future when they are really dealing with the here and now. Their policy agenda is how to get over the current challenges that are in headlines in the newspapers today. So if we wanted their cooperation, if we wanted their data, we had to give them some assurance that, yeah, we would study the region, but in such a way that no voting constituent would ever identify that their house or their suburb was at threat, and then go knocking on the door of the local council and saying, what's your solution, when they haven't got a solution. So this sort of research is not without its challenges, and whether or not, you know, we are able, as we hope to, deconstruct this hypothetical back to real life at the end of the project remains debatable. I mean, technically we can do it, but politically, whether or not, you know, it draws so many crabs that we have some problems, is yet to be negotiated. But that's the plan. So, okay, scenario planning. If we look at what this is about, this is not modelling. This is looking at not trying to predict the future. This is merely coming up with a description of possible futures. So I want to make that clear distinction about what we are doing and what we're not doing. And we want to develop these descriptions or narratives about possible futures in order to use as a test bed for policy. That's the end game. So we construct these with the community. So this is a heavy dose of community engagement, or stakeholder engagement, I should be more precise, because it's not open to the community at large, but to stakeholders. And we want to take the stakeholders, particularly those people, you know, who are policy developers, who are people who are responsible for implementation of policy, with us in this process, so therefore they are better prepared should these scenarios eventuate, or part of them eventuate. So it really revolves around a central question for these scenarios. And the question that we focus the scenario building on is what current and future drivers of change will influence the region in the next 20 years, and which need to be taken into account when developing climate change adaptation actions for this region and its particular settlement types. And because we're dealing with a hypothetical, we've got 6 human settlement types in our typology, from master plan communities that aren't there yet, but plans are on the shelf to go with them, right through to ageing suburbs, middle suburbs that flood regularly, that are inhabited by low socioeconomic, heavy rental dependent populations. A town centre, we've got the higher end of a Gold Coast situation, half residents and half tourists, high rise, etc., etc. Canal estates built in the 60s with AV-jetting houses and the like. So, okay, 20 years is the fixation there. And of course, the drivers of change that we're taking into account are a whole raft of international or global to local drivers, but also a whole raft of thematic drivers as well. So the framework in which we've now come up with, having run a series of stakeholder workshops throughout the region, if you look at the sort of axis here that we're sort of looking at the spectrum, this is community responsibility and involvement, from low degrees of involvement and action through to high, and then forms of governance from inclusive to exclusive. And we can populate the quadrants there just using some arbitrary titles. The lost opportunity scenario, a freed ride scenario, a people power scenario, and a shared path scenario. And this is what I find so interesting to the way in which the previous session and the way in which Alan drew that discussion together, because it fits neatly into our thinking about the two. Well, in the theory of scenario planning is you unpack 2. You don't try to go through 3, and 4 is onerous. So within the bounds of our limited time and finances, We're going to do two, and we've decided to go with the shared path scenario and a free ride scenario. And you can see where they fit in that model. So the shared path scenario, we would argue, would be characterised by extremely high levels of community acceptance of responsibility, self-empowerment and involvement in governance and in the management of community affairs, and operating in a political system offering a high degree of inclusive governance for its citizens. I mean, at one stage we called that a brave new world, but that was being, you know, a bit presumptuous. So we're trying to come up with some neutral terms, hence the term shared path. And the question is, you know, do we see that emerging now, or should we see that emerging in order to better address climate change adaptation, particularly in the sense of a more resilient community? So at the moment, you know, you could argue this would only be facilitated by a changing political will and changing political priorities, operating in a new paradigm in politics of community engagement. The free ride scenario, we describe this at this stage, and this is still work in being. It's characterised by extremely low levels of community responsibility and involvement in governance, in the management of community affairs, and operating in a political system offering a low degree of inclusive governance for its citizens. And you've got to wonder whether or not that's where we are really now, where, you know, the community expects Big Brother to look after them in any event. You know, if we haven't got insurance, well, someone, you know, is going to stand up a community fund, and that'll cover us, and so on. So there's no need to take any responsibility, so, and blah, 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 blah. So we're in the process now of populating these two scenarios to take them out 20, 30, 50 years, and as I said, to use those in a test bed. So there's the two scenarios, going through a wind tunnel test of adaptation options, and into this process now we drive in existing policies that stand up in Queensland and South East Queensland in particular through planning processes and the climate change adaptation or the climate change work the government's doing. And we drive those into the process, as well as new policy that we ourselves will develop where there's currently deficiency. So it's retrofitted policy, existing policy and new policy that we can now use. The whole idea is to look for signposts. Signposts that tell us that we're dangerously moving in a dangerous direction, in which case there's threats, and also where are the opportunities in this climate change scenarios. And if we can identify some of those, then we can better position ourselves to take advantage of them. Can I just finish with this quick one? So dealing with the uncertainty, we need to move to an adaptive management process. And that's where planning is not at the moment. Planning is normally linear. Start the plan, finish the plan, publicise it, politicians get the photograph taken, and everyone goes home and it's hunky-dory. But we need to get into a cyclic planning process. Now, in South East Queensland, that can be done from what we've understood at the moment. There's your plan. If there could be monitoring and evaluation done, which there partly is, looking at sustainability indicators, a monitoring program that's funded, through some sort of process to evaluate and review, to get true learning into this process, and also, as the climate science evolves, we can then draw it into this cyclic process, because it's not linear anymore. You don't have an end point to planning. So as you continue the planning process, you introduce the new science, and that feeds back to reinforce the plan itself. And the indicators that we want to use are those signposts that come out of that, that scenario planning that I spoke about before.